Andy, go ahead and click. You're good to go, Ev. Going live.
Are you sure? I'm live?
You are live.
So live right now. All right, welcome to class 7, May 5th, 2021. I'm in, where am I at? Florida, doing some work and yeah, some teaching from a hotel room. Got my friends here, Queen. They're going to get us through today. It'll be a good day. We're going to pick up from where we left off, which was the technical stuff. And some of the stuff we already kind of covered on Monday. So it should go pretty well. Happy Cinco de Mayo for those of you, I guess, are into that. All right, here's our day. We'll check in, not so much as, because we don't have everybody, here. It's just me in a hotel room by myself. So I can't see any of you or any of that stuff. Hopefully you've read through chapter 5 if you're keeping up. If you're not keeping up, don't worry about it. It's really your intention, for the class. If your intention is to take the exam and pass it, well, then, you'll want to catch up at some point. But, some of us are just here to learn stuff together. So that's cool. Questions, lots of places you can send those. I know that on the FRSecure CISSP Mentor Program email, we're switching from one person to another on who's going to answer those. So if you haven't gotten an answer to an email you've sent into that yet, be patient. It's coming. So that's good stuff. 107 slides. It's actually more than that. I didn't update the slide and I kept adding content. Partially ADD, partially I just want to help more. So that's what we get. We're going to finish chapter 5 today, and then I'll be back in town on Monday. I think we have class again, and then yeah, we'll teach more. Study tips, small amounts frequently. These are just study tips, that I've read over the years that seem to help people. I'm learning Spanish right now, coincidentally, and it's Cinco de Mayo. And this is really true. 20 to 30 minutes each day helps, or maybe a few 20 to 30 minute sessions in a day. But it's that consistency. Those are the things that kind of drill it into your brain. So stay consistent. Flashcards, practice test, apps work. I know the FRSecure website is a really good resource. And I know we have a code for that. Take naps. I just took a nap when I got here in Orlando. Where am I at? Cocoa Beach. Be down in Boca Raton tomorrow, whatever. But I took a nap. Naps are good. Take many naps. The older you get, the more we like naps. Write things down, say them out loud. That also helps. There's a connection between you writing it down, your brain, putting it on paper, that really helps with memory. So if you're struggling with some of those, especially those security models, those things that really weren't all that practical, try writing them down. Write them down on a notebook, and I think you'll find it maybe a little easier. That's it. If you haven't signed up already, there's again the study group practice test. There's the Secure website or FRSecure website that we talked about. Clint Dupuis, been around for a long time, done a lot of good things for our community, kind of an unsung hero. He runs that site. So yeah, go see him. Oh boy. All right. How many bits composed? This is a quiz. How many bits compose an IP6 address? 128.96.32.64. 96 doesn't really fit for sort of anything we talked about recently. 32 would be our, IP version 4 IP address. 64, maybe our MAC address, or 128 is the right answer for our IP version 6 address. So that's the correct answer. That's IP version 4. Which of the following is used to find the media access control address that matches a known internet protocol address? So we're trying to find, you have to read these questions when you take the exam too. Make sure you don't go too fast, right? Because ARP is the more popular, but we're not trying to find the MAC address. We're trying to find the IP address with the MAC address. So this is actually reverse ARP, not ARP. So if you go too fast, that's where a lot of people make mistakes on this stuff. So the right answer, even though it says ARP there, if I'm trying to find the MAC address that matches the I talked myself out of the damn answer. Son of a gun. But be careful when you read the question. Don't read it like I just did, because that is the right answer. If I was trying to find the IP address from a known MAC address, that would be reverse ARP. Sorry. Cool. Also called hardware address, which we've talked about before, and that's also called a logical address. So if you hear those things, referred to that way, that's what we're talking about. Spoofing attack at layer 2 of the OSI model. If you remember layer 2, that's data link. We have two kind of sub layers there, the media access control and the logical link control sub layers of layer 2. And hopefully you've been working on memorizing the OSI model if you haven't already. Application, presentation, session, transport, network, data link, physical, going down. I've always memorized it going down, but it's important for you to remember that. So this is layer 2, data link, those two sub layers. So spoofing attack. So what is spoofable really at layer 2? Really, the MAC address would be spoofable because we're usually trying to resolve the MAC address from that IP address or vice versa. So you could kind of maybe do a little bit of D on this one, but really the right answer is C. This would be MAC spoofing that hardware address, usually burned into the NIC. Also called an ARP poisoning attack. If you've never, you can play with this if you want. I don't know if your home is susceptible to an ARP poisoning attack, but you can play with it. One of the tools that you can use that's got a nice little GUI to it that it's free. You can try Cain Enable. It's been around forever. It hasn't been updated forever, but it still works. So Cain Enable is a good, tool to mess around with. You can actually do ARP poisoning attacks with Cain Enable if you want. All right, below you have a list of protocols on the left side and a list of ports on the right side. So I did say on Monday, you'll need to memorize some of these ports. Now, memorizing Kerbos and Secure LDAP, you may not see that on the exam, maybe you will, but it is important to, to memorize some of these ports, as many as you can. So ports on the left side with protocols on the left side with ports on the right side. Using your mouse, select the proper. This would be and this will be an example of kind of one of the types of questions you'll see on the exam too, right? It's not all multiple choice. It used to be all multiple choice, but now we've got click this, matching things, and what are those other ones? Whatever, a bunch of different kind. All right, so HTTPS, that one maps down to 443. NetBIOS maps to what, 137, 139. Kerberos 88, LDAP 389, Secure LDAP 636 or something like that. So that's what you should be looking at. Cool. Which layer does IPsec operate? So again, they're talking about the OSI model because session, data link, transport, and network, those are all, OSI model layers. So which layer does the IPsec operate? Now, if you can't remember exactly, and we haven't covered IPsec in detail yet, so it's okay. Data link is that, layer 2. Network would be, upper layer 3, session and transport above that. Mostly it works in the network layer. So we'll cover that, more. Really, two protocols that are, I think, the most important for IPsec for us to get to, and we will get to that tonight, is encapsulating security payload, ESP, and authentication header, AH. We'll show what those packets look like. There's also a bunch of helper protocols with IPsec2. ISA Camp is, a big one, which usually is a negotiation. Its job is to sort of negotiate the IPsec tunnel and encryption. But anyway, this is your answer. Oh boy, it's a big question. So one of the tips you can do with questions like this, if you want to, and I think maybe Brad might have covered it, is start at the actual question, right? And you'll probably be able to answer it without all the fluff on the top. So if we do that, at which layer do network interface cards and drivers convert bits into electrical signals? What the hell's a signal? I need more energy drink. Electrical signals and control aspects of data transmission, including optical, electrical, mechanical requirements. So this one, you can cross off layer 6, right? That's the presentation layer. That's not its function. What the presentation layer does is really convert data for presentation for the application. So that's where compression and all that good stuff happens. Layer 4, that's, IP lives there. That's routing and things like that. So that's not the same. So then it's a question of layer 2 or layer 1. And here it says at which layer do network interface cards and drivers, right? And that's more, converting it into those bits is layer 1. Now, if you answer layer 2, I can totally see how you would do that, because when you talk about Nick and the drivers actually work at layer 2, converting those to bits is really a shared function, right? It's not necessarily all that cut and dry. So I think if you did layer 2 on this one, that'd probably be an okay answer too. Hopefully you don't get an ambiguous, question like this one in the on the real exam. All right, so domain 4. Hopefully that all made sense, and you're sort of keeping up. If you're not, don't worry about it. I've said this so many times. If this is your first time through a lot of this content, don't try to master it the first time through. Just listen, try to take in as much as you can. The second time through, maybe try to put those concepts together, and then into like blobs, and then the third time try to master it. So if this is your first time through, you're not there yet. All right, so where we left off, network architecture and design, secure network devices and protocols. There's going to be some overlap from what I talked about on Monday to what we're going to talk about today. Again, good domain for the technical people. Some of us, this is really, really basic and fundamental. If you're a network engineer, it's like, maybe this is reminders, but it's really, really basic, Starting at 253, I believe, on the book. If you've got the book, that's where you want to open it up to. First, we're going to talk about T1s, T3s, E1s, and E3s. E's are Europe, so that's easy to remember, right? Europe versus the T1s and T3s were US, so T carriers. These were standards on how signaling was done on DS is the actual signaling standard, and then they were bundled kind of in this T1, T3. Also a standard. Things to remember, you don't need to go real deep into T1s, T3s, and how they operate and how they signal and all that other stuff, because there's a lot to it. What we really need to remember for the exam is bandwidth and just the basics about how they work. So here, T1s, a dedicated 1.544 megabit circuit. If you bundle those circuits together, you get the T3, right? So DS1, T1 are often used interchangeably. They're actually different. One's a signaling standard and the other one's a carrier standard, but for the test, if you use them interchangeably, that's probably going to be okay. Yeah, so that's at T3s, 28 bundled T1s. So if you do the math, 28 bundled T1s, you come up with their 44. Oftentimes we'll just round it up and say 45 megabits per second. A lot of times with T1s, we'll just say that they're 1.5. But memorize this, but it should be pretty easy, I think. T3, just like T1s and DS1s, T3s and DS3s are also sort of used interchangeably. Now in Europe, they had a different standard. The stuff was basically the same. Copper wire is a copper wire. It was the equipment and the standards that were used in the equipment that really was different. So E1's 2.048 megabit circuit, 30 channels, and E3's 24. E1's a lot of times we would raise this. We actually oftentimes would call it 36, but 34.368 megabits. Yeah, Sonnet was a ring, sort of a ring network too, but still used today. Packet switch. Okay, so frame relay is sort of dead, but it's still testable and still on the exam. You might run into it, somewhere, sometime. It was really, really popular in maybe the early 2000s for a while, 90s even. Packet switch network. So remember we had circuit switch and packet switch, the difference being that a circuit switch network would raise the circuit or establish the circuit, and then all the data would go across that circuit. Whereas a packet switch network, it could take all kinds of different paths. It's more of a kind of a virtual circuit. And if you take that to the TCP IP, a lot of times it's TCP that's establishing that virtual sort of circuit, but that's a packet switch network. Here, this is also a packet switch network. No error recovery. You need the higher level protocols for that. It's really built for speed, even though it's sort of been deprecated today. Things to remember about frame relay is layer 2. So layer 2 means you can run anything really above it. So I can run any protocol, like the IP protocol suite. I can run IPX over this. I could run AppleTalk if I wanted to, but really IP would be the most common. 2 types of virtual circuits. So when I say a virtual circuit, it's brought up and they communicate, but it's still a packet switch network, right? It still can take different paths, based on what happens in that virtual circuit. So it gets a little confusing. Like this isn't a circuit switch network; it's a packet switch network, but there are circuits that are built within that within frame relay. Two types: the permanent virtual circuit, always connected. This would be an always on. It was usually dedicated bandwidth, little more expensive because you had that dedicated bandwidth, but it was also wasteful because if you're not using the bandwidth, the circuit's still up. So PVCs, and then SVCs were switched virtual circuits, which would raise more on demand and would be established and torn down. You'll see DLCs, data link connection identifiers. That's how you identify on the carrier network what frame relay network this actually belongs to. So that's DLCs. We don't have to go into a lot of detail about frame relay. I think that's these basics would be enough for you. And this is what the layer 2 stuff looks like. So you have your DLC, that's your data link connection identifier, beacons and all that good stuff. These are different types of WAN sort of connections and protocols. So an ATM based, you don't have to memorize this. All of this is if you are, a network person and you wanted to see the differences between the two, like you've probably heard of MPLS, you can run frame relay over MPLS and you can kind of see how that gets, shoved in there. Yeah, more for reference. You don't have to memorize this. I just thought it was, useful for people who want to see different types of applications of frame relay. Other WAN technologies, X.25. X.25 is really old. It had so much error correction stuff built into it. It was what you needed to do back then, right? Because we didn't have really solid network infrastructure. So there were a lot of errors. There were a lot of ups and downs and things. So X.25 served its purpose there because it did a lot of error control, a lot of error correction. Nowadays, it's not used anymore because our networks are a lot more resilient. So we don't need, all that error correction. Can carry other products. These are layer 2 protocols, so they can obviously carry other protocols that operate, at a higher level, like TCP/IP. ATM was really cool because it sort of used, but ATM because it was fixed 53-byte cells, so it was very predictive, right? You could easily predict how the network was going to function depending on how you used it, because every cell was 53 bytes. You could also start to do forwarding at routers before reading the entire cell because you know how long this cell is going to be. Whereas on an Ethernet network, for instance, you've got different packet sizes. So it was very fast and very useful. But that's about all you need to know for ATM. Asynchronous transfer mode, 53 bytes, 5-byte header, 48-byte data portion. And you can see what that looks like, what's in that actual header down on the bottom. What you see in that diagram is not testable. It's just, again, for reference in case you want to know more. SDLC and HDLC. So HDLC pretty much replaced SDLC. These are still, every single one of these protocols that we've talked about so far are all layer 2 protocols. This uses polling to transmit data, and almost like token networks. But you remember when I went through the network architectures, you had the one that was polling, which is usually for like mainframes. You had one central system and it would poll, essentially ask who wants to communicate, right? It happens very fast. And then that's how you would control the traffic. SDLC works the same way. It's not the most efficient way to do networks, but SDLC has also been mostly replaced. Yeah, that's SDLC. HDLC, the successor, 3 modes of HDLC, and you can get deeper into HDLC, but I think this will be enough for you to memorize for the exam. There's probably more detail in the books. You've got normal response mode, asynchronous response mode, and asynchronous balanced mode. Now, normal response mode there is synchronization. You can only with that polling, so it almost works like it's almost like an SDLC emulation, where I will work when I'm given kind of permission to work. Asynchronous response and balance mode, I don't necessarily need to have that permission. I can initiate conversations or communication on the network myself. That's probably the biggest difference. This is what they look like. So PPP, point-to-point protocol, is another protocol that we'll cover a little bit more tonight. It's a comparison between SDLC on the top, that's an SDLC frame, and the HDLC frame is on the bottom. When you see the one there, the 1, 1, 2, 2, those are bytes, whereas on the top you see bits for the SDLC. Really sort of similar. We've got the type proprietary there that we don't have in the SDLC. That's probably the biggest difference. And that type proprietary will also call out one of those 3 modes. Converged protocols. So taking protocols and sort of mushing them together is, we think about converged protocols. Often, like in smart grid kind of stuff, is where you might see some of this, controllers, things like that. Not going to be super testable, so you don't really need to go any further than this. The distributed network protocol, DNP3, is the open standard that's probably the most common. And you can see what those packets look like and how they work. DNP3 basically runs on top of it and kind of mushes it all down. And there's DNP3 again, and how that works. So you see the DNP3 sort of, like I said, works on the application presentation layer, a little bit on transport and kind of, or session, and kind of scrunches things down for the rest of the network communications. Storage protocols, the 2 that will be probably on the test is frame or fiber channel over Ethernet and iSCSI. This is if you had a SAN, a storage area network. How do those controllers speak to each other? How do you determine where this gets written? All that kind of stuff. You might have multiple SAN switches that need to communicate with each other. They would be using these protocols to do that. Fiber channel over Ethernet. It runs, essentially it looks and acts a lot like TCP/IP, but it has its own control on the top. Basically, your HBAs, those would be put into switches and all your SAN devices, to communicate. It's kind of a specialized network interface card. iSCSI. The thing about iSCSI is it's even more flexible because usually with fiber channel over Ethernet, it's a very localized storage array, whereas iSCSI allows me to really do it all over the place. Most people still keep their storage arrays kind of close together, and anyway, even if they're using iSCSI, but you could do storage, distribute your storage devices across wide ranges, wide area networks, with iSCSI. This is what they look like. You don't need to worry so much about SPR, ISER, but iSCSI, high level stuff, right? A lot of functionality pushing down into TCP and IP. iSCSI, being that it does that, allows you to do the, over really any network. And then fiber channel adds a little more overhead to it. Voice over IP, voice over IP, lots of different vulnerabilities with voice over IP, but we don't need to know all that much. We just need to know the basics about voice over IP and how it works. If you remember, plain old telephone service still exists in some places, sort of dying, a slow death. But voice over IP allows me to take that same service that was on a dedicated circuit switched network and be able to use the advantages of a packet switched network like the internet or a local area network to carry voice traffic. That's all it does. You've got the main protocols here, our real-time transport protocol that actually carries the data. Session initiation protocol, pretty self-explanatory. It initiates the session. It basically builds up that virtual circuit between communicators. Secure real-time transport protocol gives you the ability to encrypt the voice communications. Without that, if you're just running RTP, it's really easy to eavesdrop into communications, right? So there you go. IPsec, yeah, you can see the cool thing about, protocols and protocol suites and things, like voice over IP is you can get really creative on everything that happens below it. How can I take this higher level protocol and bundle it in with other protocols to make certain things? So in this case, I can take RTP, which is a higher level protocol, primarily works, I'd say, session presentation layer. I can take the lower level protocols where IPsec works at layer 4, right? We talked about that encapsulation. As things go down the protocol, I add a new header. Oftentimes I add a new trailer. With IPsec, I'd be adding both, which provides that additional security. So it's just another thing I can do with voice over IP. This is what voice over IP looks like. So, as I said, RTP, those things run at the session layer, TCP and IP, that's transport layer, and then the other layer. So these things that happen at these higher levels, I can encapsulate with different things in the bottom. It gives me a lot of flexibility in how I can use these things. Now, I caution, against, deviating from standards that much, but you could create all kinds of cool little things with different protocols at lower levels. All right, wireless local area networks. Everybody's got a wireless network. I'm on a wireless network. I'm also on, VPN. So hopefully you guys will do that too. But wireless local area networks uses wireless signaling frequencies to allow computers to communicate really less bound by physical media. So electromagnetic waves, radio, light. Radio is much more common than light. I don't know if we get into other types of wireless like microwave. Microwave is site to site, usually limited to a few miles. I don't think we have to cover that here. Wireless local area networks, more like local. Most common form of wireless, anytime you see an 802 dot, you see these 802s, right? We say 802.3 for Ethernet. We saw 802.5 for token ring, 802.11 here, 802. There's a lot of 802s. Every one of those 802s is an IEEE standard. So whenever you see that 802, that means it's standardized by IEEE. So the most common wireless data networking, 802.11. Yeah, the first one with reasonable security. Everything's reasonable, I guess. The one thing with wireless networks, you can always jam signals, so you never can really protect against availability as much as you can be confidentiality and data integrity. Yeah, physical launching a denial of service is just launching a bunch of interference. You can do a denial of service in some wireless networks with a microwave oven, right? Or a TV remote control. Used to be wireless phones would interfere a lot because they're running on same or similar frequencies. Wireless networks today run on unlicensed bands. So you have licensed bands. Those are bands that the FCC has specifically assigned for specific purposes. Then there's a whole bunch of spectrum that's allowed for unlicensed use, right? So that allows a whole bunch of wireless networking manufacturers to all kind of share, all kind of play in that range versus each one of them getting their own licensed band, which would be very difficult. I think it would also, you wouldn't have any competition. So ISM bands, cordless phones, I mentioned that, Bluetooth and ISM bands. Two most popular ISM bands today, still 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. This is what it looks like if you're into wireless bands. This is what you need to memorize. This is not. This just gives you a little more context of where things play on these wireless bands. 3 ways. This is how multiple systems can kind of communicate at the same time on wireless networks, right? Because it almost like carrier sense multiple access collision detection, like I talked about on Monday with Ethernet networks. This is kind of that same concept, but with wireless networks. And it's actually collision avoidance, sort of, right? Because that stuff runs on layer 2, but it'll be dependent on this stuff here that runs at layer 1. Hopefully that makes sense. Things to remember are these 3 methods, right, of accessing the local, the wireless local area network. So frequency hopping, spread, spectrum. Don't try to say that fast 5 times. It basically, throughout the radio band, it just hops, right? And that's what it looks like on a oscilloscope. It just hops, right? It just keeps changing through the band. Those are sort of agreed upon between when you connect to the wireless network on how which hop or which band you're going to communicate with channel. Direct sequence, spread spectrum, spreads it over the radio band. And then orthogonal frequency division multiplexing crunches it sort of all together and does kind of a well, here, it makes it more sense if you look at the way they work. This is DSSS, so that direct sequence and frequency hopping sequence. You can see the hopping, and whereas direct sequence is over the entire band, there's still some hop, but it's not, as defined. Things to remember about this is most wireless devices today are using OFDM versus these others, but you'll still see these others. And this is OFDM compared what the wireless signal looks like, between that and DSSS. You can't really find any good documentation between the difference between frequency hopping spread spectrum and orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. A lot of words. And you might see a test or two on that. Now, if you want to go down the path of learning more about wireless networks, this would be the very beginning of kind of digging into that. This is also where that stuff runs. I mentioned, a little bit ago that this is physical layer stuff, the data link layer stuff. That's where that carrier sense multiple access runs, is in the data link layer. But this is all physical layer stuff. And you can see the different standards and the different access methods that they use. We don't have to learn about MIMO. MIMO is actually much more common nowadays, but it's not testable. The three that will be testable will be FHSS, DSSS, and OFEM. A little more about wireless networks. The different IEEE standards. I mentioned that every 802 is an IEEE standard. You can see the 802.3. So I mentioned these already. 802.3, there's your Ethernet, 802.5, token ring, all the way down to 802.11, which is wireless networks. So those are all different standards. So every wireless local area network will be an 802.11 something, right? And then as they continue to add more, features, the technology continues to evolve. You'll start seeing more and more letters. Now we're in double letters, so you've got the 802.11 AC. The ones that are most common, that you probably see the most, A, B, G, and N. AC is, making itself known, but those are the ones that you see, I think, most often. And their speeds and the range. This would be a good slide to memorize. I think minus, I wouldn't spend any time on 802.6. I wouldn't spend any time on 802.7, 802.8, 802.9, 802.10. But certainly 3, 5, and 11 on the right side, and then A, B, G, and N on the left side. A little more about A, B, G, and N and AC. When they were approved or ratified by IEEE, the rate, so maximum data rate, sort of the same thing as this. Now there's a little bit of difference, right? You see the 1.3 megabits per second on the 802.11c, and you see the 6.77 gigabits per second. So even between different organizations, you'll see sort of argument. The ones you won't see argument is A, B, and G. They're pretty solid. It's either 11 or 54 megabits per second. But when you get into N and AC, it's how you use it sometimes. There's other variables, but that's okay. You don't have to memorize that. Modulation, there's our modulation. So OFDM, DSSS, the most, and that would be by default. You can get these to run on others potentially, depending on the hardware. Radio frequency band, 5 or 2.4 gigahertz across everything. That's the unlicensed band. So that's why you see that commonly used, across all of them. So this is a good one to memorize too. Pros and cons, you often get people asking, which one should I use? Which one works better for what? This is a pretty good slide for that. Nowadays you kind of get them crunched into one device, so it's not as big a deal. All right, so different wireless networks can be set up in different ways, right? A system like my computer now is actually set in client mode, right? Client mode means that the only thing that it's going to be able to connect to is an access point, basically. That's client mode or managed mode. Master mode is kind of the other way around, right? This point is running in master mode or infrastructure mode. And the only thing that it can connect with basically is clients that are in managed mode. You've also got peer-to-peer communications, ad hoc mode, and then you've got monitor mode, which is something like KISSMET would be used for. Uh, Easier to do on Linux systems for sure. But if I wanted to sniff network traffic, which is kind of cool. I mean, if you've got, $50 to go out and get yourself a Raspberry Pi and load some, KISSMET's pretty easy to install, and then you can see all the wireless networks around you. You'll be surprised at how many, because you'll pick people that drive by that are beginning too. It's kind of interesting when you put something in monitoring mode. But anyway, manage mode, that's my system. It's in managed mode. That means I can only connect to master mode. Master mode, the opposite way around. Ad hoc means I can do this peer-to-peer thing. I don't need to have an access point. And then monitor mode is basically promiscuous mode for a wireless, wireless card. It's a screenshot of KISSMET. KISSMET's, if you haven't played with KISSMET and you're into that kind of thing, it's free, right? And there are instructions all over the internet on how you can install it and play with it and use it. It's sort of interesting. I have it running at my home, but I'm weird. Other things about wireless. So SSID, that's your service set identifier. The service set identifier is basically the name of the network. It serves a purpose because it's almost like a username and password, right? I have my username, which might be eFrancine, but then I got to have my password to authenticate. Service set identifiers kind of work a little bit the same way, right? It's like a username, right? But it's for the network. So SSIDs kind of work for that. That's what SSIDs are kind of used for. Wireless clients need to know the SSID before joining the wireless network. You've probably seen that when you go into your own wireless settings. You see all the networks. You choose the SSID that you recognize, and then you connect to it. Now, some people think there's some kind of benefit to not beaconing or not sharing your SSID publicly, but it's still pretty easy to find, so it's not really that good to protect your network. Not in lieu of all the other things. Now, if you did that and had proper MAC address filtering, had WPA2 or WPA3, and pretty strong key that you changed on a regular basis, or you're using extensible authentication, use a combination, right? We talked about that defense in depth. Just using this isn't going to do you much good. Other things about SSIDs, we don't like to see SSIDs that identify the physical location whenever possible. So, I wouldn't put my home address in my home SSID. I wouldn't put my family's name. I wouldn't put Francine Network on my SSID. I don't really want people to know where my, who's using this network. Now, you can still find it, right? If you've got maybe a Yagi antenna and we used to do war driving a lot. You can see where that signal strength continues to get closer and find it that way, but just a good practice not to put your SSIDs as a physical identifier. WEP, bad, should be dead everywhere. It's kind of interesting that it's even an option. I mean, I understand legacy and backwards compatibility, but nobody should be running WEP anywhere. It's very, very weak. The implementation of encryption is terrible. There's no initialization vector. So it's very, very predictable. Used to be, if you capture less than a gigabyte of data, you will crack the WEP key, no matter how strong that WEP key is. And most people are such, we're all kind of data pigs. It doesn't take long to catch a gigabyte of data on a wireless network. So don't use WEP. It's bad. Frames, no timestamps, no replay protection. It's just, it's bad. Here are the weaknesses. Key management and key size are bad. IV, most WEP, actually lots of WEP implementations don't have an IV, but if they do have an IV, it's super small. And the reason why that IV wants to be, that implements randomization into, the hashing. RC4 is weak. Yeah, it's bad. So 802.11i came about afterwards. Now, in between that, there was 802.11i is WPA2. There was the WPA as kind of because once WEP was known to be as weak as it was, there was kind of this big rush in our industry to get off of WEP, but it takes a little while to go through IEEE and get everybody to ratify the new standard of WPA2. So in between, there was kind of this WPA that was implemented. WPA2 it's strong, very strong. It did stop us from going to the next level. We do have a WPA3. Reasonable security. Pluggable authentication modules means that I can use extensible authentication protocols. I can use certificates for authentication. I can use, a bunch of different methods. I'm not stuck with just basically a password or a key. Allows cryptographic ciphers, vulnerabilities, so you can change ciphers fairly easy. It's very plug and play, pluggable. Uses AES. So we talked a little bit about AES versus RC4, right? Both secret key encryption protocols, but RC4 is just really weak. And temporal key integrity protocol is really to do the integrity of the data. So the good thing about TKIP is, in terms of picking up on what it does, that word integrity means a lot. It also does confidentiality, but integrity is a big deal. So here's WPA or WEP. WPA, this is a good one to, again, to memorize, to reference. WPA3 won't be on the test, but it is out there, so it's good to know that it's out there. But you can see the difference, different encryption standards, RC4. WPA still used RC4. We had that kind of in-between time between when we went from WEP to WPA2. So we still used RC4, but then we added, TKIP for some of the confidentiality and integrity stuff. PSK, pre-shared key, is what that stands for. So WPA pre-shared key, that's what most of us are used to. Basically, sometimes people refer to it as the password for the wireless network. And then WP Enterprise, which gives you more extensibility. Those are the important things I think to remember about WEP, WPA, and WPA2. A lot of good stuff. Bluetooth. I hate Bluetooth. It's really convenient, right? But it's really not secure. So we talk about PANs, WANs, MANs, LANs, and GANs. Way back, this would be the PAN piece. Usually limited to about 100 meters. There's lots of things, lots of ways to hack Bluetooth, because it's really not built for security. One of the things that ticks me off about Bluetooth is the way you end up connecting with things that you didn't really think that you were going to connect to. You can certainly delete those pins, but how often do people do that? So it's not uncommon, or I forget to delete one myself on my iPhone, and my wife will pull up in her car, and I'm having a conversation, and the next thing I know, it's happening in the car. So my wife is now having the conversation. So it's a good idea that when you're done with Bluetooth, if you're doing these kind of transient Bluetooth connections, to go ahead and delete it and just reconnect if you really wanted, that level of security. Otherwise, you have those kind of glitchy things that happen with Bluetooth. So 2.4 gigahertz frequency, same as 802 dot whatever. Now this is an IEEE standard too. So Bluetooth, small, low power, doesn't really go fast, but doesn't need to either, because you're only over a short distance. So 3 megabits per second over 100 meters. You're still pushing data pretty good. 3 classes. So class 3, 10 meters, class 2, 10 meters, class 1, 100 meters, class 3 is actually under. The E0 symmetric cipher is super weak. That's one of the problems with Bluetooth, and that's, most Bluetooth devices are still using that. If you want to know more about Bluetooth, this is just a good reference. So this stuff is plenty for you for the exam. And that's the thing about, when we talk about a lot of these things, I always feel like I'm kind of going like half in on all of these things. And I have to stop myself regularly from like going deeper into like how Bluetooth operates or how, frame relay operates, because it's not relevant to the exam. We can have those conversations, but the point isn't for us to be experts on these things. The point is for us to know enough to be able to put these things in the context with everything else. So that's one of the struggles too about just the onslaught, the fire hose of information. It's really important that you get all of that, because you have to put all this stuff into context. Like, where's my most significant risk? Where should I spend the next information security dollar? Is it on a Bluetooth vulnerability? Is it on something with my wireless network? Is it an Ethernet? There's just so many different pieces to it. That's kind of the point for the CISSP, is to be able to put things into context, not necessarily to master anything. If you want to master, if there's parts of this that are really intriguing to you and you want to go deeper, that's why I provide a lot of these resources. If you want to go deeper, go deeper. We need people in all this stuff. All right, RFID, radio frequency identification. Big, right? You got it on your phone, you got it on your access card. Some people have it in their body. Got it on your phone or your credit cards. It's really close proximity communications. Simple communications, usually simple instructions. It really kind of started off with, in inventory systems. But for our purpose, you see that little, I don't want any kind of chip in my body. We have one of the guys at work actually has his access card in a chip in his hand. So it's going to suck when we deactivate. If he ever leaves, hopefully he never leaves, because if he does, we have to deactivate that, and then you got that damn thing stuck in there. Maybe you can reprogram it. 3 types of RFID tags. This is the most important thing for the exam: active, semi-passive, and passive. Active, pretty self-explanatory. It has a battery. It is broadcasting a signal. Those signals are relatively easy to pick up. I'm trying to think of where I would actually use this. Total transponder. So when you're driving down the road, like here in Florida, that would be an active, because it's actively polling for those boxes that are in people's cars. Usually not high security stuff necessarily. It's more higher performance things. It needs to work really fast. So it's constantly sort of out beaconing. That's what active RFID does. It does operate over larger distances, and that's actually a function of the amount of power behind it. More power, longer distance. Semi-passive, they have a battery, but you have to get closer to the reader. So I'm trying to think of who's the RID readers, RID readers. RID, is that right? Whatever, you've seen them. Your card gets closer to it, and it sort of powers it up a little bit, or it shares that power. That's one example. Passive is the most common. It's also the cheapest. It means that as you get closer to the reader, it's going to use that power. Like on my phone, that would be an active, probably, depending on the application, maybe semi-passive. Like my access card to get into the office, most of those are passive. They don't have a battery, but when they get close enough to it, it'll pull the power from that signal. Inventories are really kind of common way where RFID is used for passive. But hopefully that makes sense. Active, semi-passive, and passive. 2 of them, the active and the semi-passive, have batteries. The difference is active is out actively sort of looking for things to communicate with, whereas semi-passive, you have to get closer to something for it to communicate with you. Whereas passive they're kind of like, they have chips, but there's no power to them, and they draw power from something else for them to work. Faraday cage, if you're a little more paranoid, you could certainly, Faraday cages, what they do is they stop electrical signals from sort of getting out or getting in. So in high security, environments, you may decide to use a Faraday cage. Really, it's metal. You could use, aluminum foil. It's funny, a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people do, those RFID wallets. I'm not a big fan of RFID wallets because those attacks are so uncommon, and you got to get sort of close to me to get it. It's just not worth it for me. Those attacks they're nowhere near as common as people think they are. Now you can go make your own RFID reader if you want. You can, I can't remember who did it first, but anyway, the instructions are online if you wanted to do it. You basically need an RFID reader pad, some simple circuitry, some software, which is all available online to build it. You can put in your book bag, and then as you walk by people, it'll capture and write that data. Probably shouldn't do it. I don't know if it's illegal, but I don't do it, but you can. All right, we talked about this on Monday, so this is kind of just refresh on all that stuff. So now we're switched. We've gone through so far at a high level, for sure, some wide area network sorts, types of protocols. Talked about SDLC, HDLC, frame relay. Talked about wireless networks, RFID a little bit. Now the stuff that we covered is probably all you're going to need for the exam. And like I said, if you want to go deeper, feel free. Now we're back to the different layers of the OSI model. What are the things that run at those layers, and what do they do? So repeaters and hubs, layer one devices, always. The main thing the difference between a repeater and a hub is a repeater is two ports, an in port and an out port, right? A hub is a multi-port repeater. It serves the same function, but it's just got multiple ports to it. No other functionality really. Collision domains, you talk about collision domains. Collision domains is there's no segmentation of the actual layer 2 traffic, so they collide a lot. You'll see a lot of collisions. Those old 3Com switches that would have that collision light that would try to detect when there were collisions on the network. Yeah, very inefficient, not to be used really in high bandwidth environments. You do have a lot of collisions. You need to segment that network. We would still use hubs potentially for some network troubleshooting, sniffing network traffic maybe. So you can see the weakened signal on the left, the repeater, regenerated signal. We would call that weakened signal. That that happens through attenuation over longer periods of time. Layer 2 devices, bridges. A bridge does the same thing as layer 1, but now we have some MAC address filtering. So bridge will build a MAC table. You can always manipulate the MAC table yourself if you want to. You can make static entries in that MAC table. But generally, the bridge will listen to which MAC address is on which port. And so if it receives traffic destined for a MAC, say port 1 and port 2, traffic comes in port 1, and the switch or the bridge looks at the MAC address and says, well, that stuff goes on, that's over here on port 1. It won't forward it to port 2. Now, same thing happens with a switch, just multi-port, right? Bridge 2 ports, switch is a multi-port bridge. Two collision domains. So because we'll have collision domains, hubs, everything's a collision domain. With a bridge, 2 collision domains. With a switch, the collision domains are really limited to each port. So there's a typical bridge. So if computer 1 wants to communicate with computer 2, the bridge will see that traffic, but it won't forward it out the other port where computer 3 and computer 4 are. That breaks the collision domain. And also makes it just a little bit more efficient. And the bridge would know that by building its own table. It would be listening to traffic and knowing what is on what, where, like I said, you can do it statically. Switches, same thing. I already mentioned this. Multi-port bridge, collision domain is limited to a single port. You can connect multiple switches together. Those are called trunk lines. Lots of other things that go into switches and how to use switches, but this is what you need to know for the exam. It would also build its MAC address table based on what it hears on each port, and it would assign, this MAC address on this port, this MAC address on this port. It is a best practice to not put multiple systems on a same access port. That's just a best practice. You could also, like I said, hard code, into the switch, what port goes to what MAC address. You can do MAC address filtering. Just about anything you want to do, layer 2 and layer 1, you can do with a switch. And in practice, really today, all of this is condensed, right? You've got multi-function systems that do firewall routing and switching and hubbing, right? They regenerate signals. They do MAC address forwarding based on what they learned on what port. They do routing and they do traffic filtering. The importance here is knowing what layers, what functions sort of happen. And just think of all these functions like a switch and a repeater and a router and a firewall all kind of getting mushed into a single chassis. That's how it works today, but knowing how each one of these things functionally works is really important too. So switches also have the ability to create VLANs. Now VLAN is essentially everything. It's a virtual local network, and you would segment all these ports here belong to this VLAN, and all these ports over here belong to this VLAN. And so if you want to go from this VLAN to this VLAN, you're going to have to go through a router, right? So you just segment it out on the switch, and it's a way to just break up those broadcast domains. So we talked about collision domain. Collision domains are, switches break up collision domains. Routers break up broadcast domains. So if you hear those things, collision domains and broadcast domains, that's sort of the difference. Now, these diagrams I think are pretty good with showing how, you can tag certain traffic for certain VLANs. So the sales, take the salesperson computer on the top there. It would be able to talk to the other salesperson on the bottom, but it wouldn't be able to talk to the technical person unless it went through the trunk, was routed to talk to the technical person. So this also gives us some security, functionality. This would be network segmentation, not network isolation. That would go to the next layer of traffic filtering from like a firewall. Make sense? Virtual LAN, inter-VLAN communications, that requires that layer 3 routing. So other things we can do with switches that are common, span ports. I would use a span port maybe for network troubleshooting or for maybe an intrusion detection or an intrusion prevention system, because those systems need to see all the network traffic on the switch potentially, or many ports on a switch, versus if you just plugged it into a normal port, it would only see the things that are destined for that port. One, only the things that were destined for that VLAN, and two, only the things that the MAC address, that the switch would forward there. So the span port allows you to basically forward all the stuff you see on these ports, also replicate on this other port. That's a span port. You can see that's a pretty good diagram of how a span port would work. And this is the difference between a span port and a tap port. So a tap port is a test access port. Can also be used for intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, but it's another piece of equipment that you may not want to, maintain. Fail open is really important on these things, because if, there are times when your security or monitoring tools might croak out, which, sends some unusual stuff to your tap, which might be a hub, to be honest, which can, if it doesn't fail open, you could take down the network. Not that I've done it, I've just heard people do it. All right, network devices. So layer 3. So layer 1, hubs, repeaters. Layer 2, bridges, switches. Layer 3, routers. So layer 3 devices are routers. They route traffic between local area networks, between VLANs. And I mentioned there the chassis. Now I'm old school. I did a lot of work on 6500, 6509, 6513s. Now they're all replaced, but that was kind of one of the first sort of, I think, chassis where we just combine kind of all these functions into a single thing. And I've kind of already alluded to that. 2 types of routes. So routers route, right? So how do we get the routes into the router? There's 2 ways, basically. Static routes, where you manually enter in the route into the router configuration, or default routes. And then there's also dynamic routes. So these aren't the types. These aren't the ways to get the routes in. Static routes are ones you type in. Default routes is, if I don't have a route for this thing, I'm going to send it there. So it's really impossible for your router to have a route to every network specifically defined in the routing table. So the default route is, if I got nowhere else to go, that go here. Static routes are ones that you manually enter into the routing table. It's not, it's more secure to route, to do static routing, probably because you have more control over the network traffic, but you also have more prone to make mistakes in complex networks because it's a lot of routes to enter. You have a routing table on your computer. So I just, went to my own, this computer and just did IP route or route print. And that's my routing table on my local computer. So it's not just route. My computer can route. It's not set up to route. It's not set up as what's a multi-NIC router proxy. It's not set up that way, but it has a routing table. And so if you wanted to do this yourself and look at the routing table on your own computer, the basics for the routing table on my own computer are basically the same thing in routers. You have a network destination, a network mask, the gateway. So where do I send that? And the interface, out what interface, and then the metric. Now you can see the 000, that's the default route. So you go back here, default routes, that's the 000. If I don't know where to go with it, I'm sending it to 192.168.0.1, out interface 192.168.0.5. And I can enter in a whole bunch of other routes, and I did just kind of change one. So you can see that on the top, route add, just added a new default route to go to 02. It didn't remove the first route, right? The 01 is still there, but now I've got two default routes. That can get kind of funky, I suppose. You might want to do something like that for resilience. I don't know. But you'd have to do a route delete or something, get that other route out of there. That's just a real simple example of static routing. The other way is routing protocols. I like routing protocols because they run, right? There's some troubleshooting involved if you chose the wrong routing protocol or if you didn't configure it correctly, but it's nice to have these routes automatically populate on more complex networks. Some things you'll hear: convergence. That's how long it takes for the routers in the domain essentially to agree with each other. That's called convergence. Some routing protocols are slower at convergence versus others. Some routing protocols build an entire topology of the domain or whatever these routers are responsible for. Others don't build a topology. They basically no hops to get to certain places. Interior gateway protocols, these are ones that are meant to run sort of within an autonomous system. So you hear the word autonomous system, it's basically like what I'm responsible for, I guess, in layman's terms. That's my autonomous system. Now on the internet, there are assigned autonomous systems that communicate with each other, and you'd use an exterior gateway protocol to communicate between those. So you have within an autonomous system, so maybe within your own local area network, maybe within your own organization, you'd be using these interior gateway protocols. If you want to communicate with something outside, like on the internet, you would need to have an exterior gateway routing protocol. But what you most commonly do is you have a default route to your ISP who's running BGP. They're maintaining those routing so you don't have to deal with it because BGP itself can get kind of funky. You would kind of want to be specialized to be working on that. Different types of routing protocols. So we're going to talk about two kinds. We're going to talk about distance vector and link state. Distance vector routing protocols, they use distance as their primary, if not sole, routing decision-making thing. The bad thing about that is you don't take into account latency, you don't take into account bandwidth, you don't take into account a lot of other things that might dictate how fast your packet gets from point A to point B. So it may not be the best route. The route may not always be the shortest distance. Distance vector routing protocols will do the shortest distance, all the time. Prone to routing loops, but we've got some things like split horizon and hold down timers. And those will both be on the test, and they're coming on a future slide too. Those are the primary things that are used to kind of prevent those routing loops. A routing loop would happen if I didn't have, say split horizon, for instance. I advertise to my neighbor router that to get to this network, you need to go here. And my neighbor router says back to me, if you want to get to this network, you go back here. So then you have this kind of like competition going on. That can easily create a routing loop, which means your traffic just kind of ends up going around and around and never gets to where it's going. That's kind of what a routing loop is. So distance vector, your routing table. So AB, you share routing tables with distance vector like RIP, for instance. You have to rely on your neighboring router for how to get places. So A doesn't talk to C, A talks to B. Hopefully you can trust B, but anyway. RIP is used in those smaller networks that are less complex that you really don't necessarily care, maybe. Really easy to figure for sure. And yeah, simple to use for simple networks. Distance vector. So RIP is the one, probably the most common distance vector routing protocol, routing information protocol is what's called. Hop count is its metric. That's the distance. Some of us, like in a car, use miles. Routers use hop count, or RIP does. No full view, so you don't see the entire topology. What you see is what your neighbor told you, right? And what you see is your neighbor. Convergence is really slow. Routing updates every 30 seconds, which can take a while. So if a network goes down, you'll have some outage, probably in some part of your network for a little while until things converge. Hop count limit 15. So after 15, it's infinite. You can't have, so in a more complex network, RIP, it just won't work. RIP version 1 and RIP version 2. RIP version 1 was classful networks only. So if you remember classful, that would be our A, B, C, and D and E. But A, B, and C primarily, we'd be stuck to those network boundaries. Whereas, RIP version 2 allows us to do some 1918 stuff that RFC 1918 with classless interdomain routing. Split horizon, I mentioned already. That's for avoiding those routing loops. So you can't argue, right? If I heard, and the way it basically works is if router A heard about whatever from router B can't go back and tell router A about that route again, right? That's kind of how split horizon works. Hold down timers, it stops flapping. Flapping happens when the network is changing faster than the convergence happens. So if you've got a network that's not very stable, you can easily have these flapping, which just creates a mess. That's an example of split horizons. Router 1 or router 2 heard about things from router 1. Router 2 is not going to go back and say, hey, did you know you can get to router? That's split horizon. Other routing protocols. So link state routing protocol, OSPF. OSPF is kind of my favorite. Open shortest path first. That's a link state routing protocol that has a bunch of different metrics that I can use. You can also segment your routing traffic based on boundaries, which is sort of neat because your network can get super complex and stay pretty manageable. That table there is probably good for you to memorize, or at least know. Distance vector sends the entire routing protocol. Link state just sends the link state information. Link state routing protocols do maintain a topology of the entire network. Distance vector doesn't. Link state's faster. There's those communications a little bit more often, and they're triggered. Distance vector routing loops, link state could have them, but really rare. Examples, RIP and IGRP, that's interior gateway routing protocol. I don't know if you'll see IGRP on the exam. You won't see extended interior gateway routing protocol because that's a Cisco proprietary, and CIS or ISC squared doesn't like to do that. The link state OSPF is kind of king. ISIS is used more within autonomous systems, maybe at ISPs. All of these, so RIP, IGRP, OSPF, and ISIS are all interior gateway routing protocols. So you see IGRP, not only is it an interior gateway routing protocol, but it's also the name. So that can sort of get confusing, but these are all interior within an autonomous system. OSPF, open shortest path first. Yeah, this is how it works. You learn the entire network topology for your area. That's essentially a boundary. So all ISP or all OSPF implementations have an area 0. That's kind of like the start, but then you can break your network in terms of routes, and not routes as much as what's responsible for what routes based on areas. Event driven updates. So I don't just do the every 30-second kind of thing. You can configure. OSPF is super configurable. You could do other updates as well, but a lot faster. And there's the area 0, area 3. ASBR is area system border router, and you got area border routers, system border router. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what that looks like. Basics, right? Basics of OSPF. an example here. So a distance vector routing protocol would go from the fastest way to get from C to B would be to go across that T1, when actually it'd be faster, even though it's 2 hops, to go through the data center. So in a link state routing protocol, it's more likely that the traffic would go from C to the data center back to B. That's just a simple, I guess, explanation. Border Gateway Protocol, this is an exterior gateway routing protocol. Now, not to confuse matters, but you could use BGP within an autonomous system, which would then make it IBGP, which is Interior Border Gateway Protocol, whatever. Think of BGP by default as being an exterior gateway routing protocol. It's sort of like a link state, sort of like a distance vector. It's kind of its own thing. Uses actual connections between routers to exchange routing information and sometimes, routing tables. You don't need to know a lot about BGP because you're probably never going to run into it unless you work for an ISP or you're into networking. But it's fairly specialized. This is the routing protocol for the internet. This is how traffic gets from places on the internet between autonomous systems, and then within autonomous systems, you've got additional interior gateway routing protocols that kind of route it through that autonomous system, then back out potentially to another autonomous system. Yeah, that's BGP. You can see there's our autonomous systems. Autonomous systems are assigned by IANA. So you have to go register your autonomous system if you want to start doing these things. I don't know what, last time I used BGP, and this is probably going to date myself, the routing table was about 128 megabytes in size, which back then was a huge routing table, but I don't know what the size is now. It's going to be huge. But you can do partial tables too, if you're into that stuff. You see within each one of these autonomous systems, like 65002, you've got OSPF, 65000 EIGRP. So those are interior gateway routing protocols, and then BGP between them, that exterior routing protocol. Right, on the firewalls, filter traffic between networks. Yeah, I like firewalls. A lot of people don't use them really all that well because firewalls don't just block the exterior traffic, the traffic you're trying to get into your network. You also need to block traffic outbound, where people don't do that nearly as much. The egress filtering outbound, but firewalls, can certainly do both of those. Packet filter and stateful firewalls make their decisions on layer 3 and 4. So if you remember layer 3, network, and layer 4, session, transport. Sorry. So TCP sockets, basically, IP address and TCP port numbers, or UDP potentially. Proxy firewalls, layers 5 and 7 are brought into it. Firewalls, multi-homed, and a bunch of different architectures. So we're going to talk about the basics of the difference between packet filter and a stateful packet filtering firewall or a stateful firewall. One basically maintains state. It has a state table, whereas a packet filtering firewall doesn't, right? Much easier to bypass a packet firewall or packet filter than it is a stateful packet inspection firewall. And we'll talk about firewall architectures here. Pretty basic. Yeah, that's fire. Yeah. Packet filtering firewall, simple, fast, because they make their decisions really simple, really fast. They don't have to maintain state. You don't need to have a bunch of memory, for a packet filtering firewall, but they're also really easily bypassed. You wouldn't use these in any kind of high security situation, really. Basically, it's going to make its decision, deny or allow. Its access control list is either going to say this traffic goes or this traffic doesn't go. Now, if you remember how we talked about TCP, we got the 3-way handshake, right? SYN, SYNAC, and the ACK back. You can convince the firewall that this is actually an ACK back, or this is part of an existing communication that's already happening. And so the firewall might think, well, okay, based on these flags, this is already a communication. I don't have any state, so I don't know if this started from this other side or not. That's primarily the way to bypass packet filter firewalls pretty easily. There's an example. Packet firewall, echo request, echo reply. Well, the attacker just does the echo reply and thinking. Now the packet firewall packet filtering firewall may think that there was already an echo request from computer one, but being that it didn't maintain state, it would allow that traffic to go through because it wouldn't know. Stateful packet inspection firewalls maintain that state. So it will maintain what's called a state table of what data is going where. So, when in that example, it's a very simple example. If the attacker is sending an echo reply, the firewall looks at the state table and says, well, there was no echo request to tie this to, so it's denied. Much more secure and probably the most common firewalls around now are the stateful packet inspection firewalls. Slower, but now we've got so much processing power and things, it's not nearly as a big deal. You can see on the right, just an example of a state table. Yeah, simple. Proxy firewalls, basically it's proxy acting. What proxy means is acting on behalf of. So the firewall acts on behalf of the client or the server or whatever. So in a full proxy, right, it's the one host has no idea who it's actually communicating with on the other side because it appears as though it's communicating just with the firewall. That's a full proxy. All the connections terminate at the firewall and they're reestablished on the other side of the firewall. Obviously much more secure, but a lot more overhead with proxies as well. Application layer proxy. So remember, layer 7 layers, right? The application layer is all the way at the top. It can make filtering decisions on anything really in the network flow. It can make, not anything. It may have troubles with encrypted traffic. You would have to have some key sharing or some functions built there. But in general, individual clicks of a mouse on a website can theoretically be filtered with application layer proxy firewalls, basically everything. So a lot of really, really tight control. Yeah. Circuit level proxy, circuit level session layer and down. So you can't, there's no visibility into application stuff that's happening, but it does maintain the session. So it is more secure. You also need to have SOCs, usually you have to have a client or something that's client-like on the client system for it to use a SOC. Listening on port 1080 by default, you can change that if you want. But basically, you can make all these filtering decisions below the session layer and below. No application stuff, no presentation layer stuff, no web filtering, nothing like that. These are the different firewalls. So this would be a good one to sort of, memorize or remember. The packet filtering firewall, transport on down, because transport is where we've got, TCP and UDP, so we can make decisions based on those sockets. The difference between packet filtering, the only difference really is the state info, that state data table. And then there's our application proxies and our circuit level proxies. Dual homed host. So these are different firewall designs. So how firewalls could actually get implemented into the environment. The oldest is the dual homed host. You have a NIC and a NIC, 2 network interface cards in the system. IP tables, maybe running your firewall between the two. Very common design. Yeah, that's a dual homed host. And it would just look like that, basically. Very simple. Not very extensible, not very flexible, but it was sort of effective. The other ones are screened host architecture. Pretty rare to use this. Basically, you'd have a bastion host, and all the traffic sort of goes to the bastion host, and the bastion host communicates with the other. So you still have the screening router, which might be just an access control list. Then you have the bastion host. So everything goes to the bastion host, and the bastion host determines, it's almost like a jump box in a way, determines, who else you can communicate with. Pretty rare, I think in the fundamental way it was designed, screen host architectures. DMZs and screen subs, these are much more popular. So you have a DMZ network. So you usually have, 3 potentially. There's multiple ways to do this. You could have one system with 3 interfaces, right? The untrusted or the internet, your DMZ, and the internal network. That's one way. Another way you can do it is a screen subnet architecture where you've got 2 individual systems. So basically almost like a dual homed host at the front end and dual homed host at the back end. and then the DMZ in between. That way is actually more secure because you can use different firewalls. So I could use maybe a Cisco and Palo Alto, or something, and then things in between. So, but it also introduced some more complexity, so that could be an issue too. But those are the kind of the differences. This is just a simple, firewall with the 3 ports, right? You've got that's the most common way to implement DMZs. DMZ. So DMZ, yeah, if you don't know, DMZ is a demilitarized zone. It's kind of the middle ground between the bad and the good. It's oftentimes you typically don't want to expose internal network resources on the internet. You typically want to expose DMZ resources on the internet. Sometimes it's a real challenge. It takes some design creativity, to put your mail server in the DMZ versus on the internal network, because it's certainly easier for my host to connect. And this is back before cloud is just an example. Now, cloud is kind of taking over a lot of the email stuff, but maybe a web server, a database server, a SQL server, where to put those in the right places. So DMZ, kind of demilitarized zone. Now this is the classic way, right? To do a DMZ, firewall, and everything in between would be your DMZ. Yep, and then that's the 3-legged one, which we already talked about a little bit. This is the most common. This one's a little more secure. This one's more common, called the 3-legged DMZ. This is the classic one. All right. Single firewall design, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that already. DMZ. Now modems. So now we're done with firewalls. It's a lot of stuff. Now modems. Kind of seems like we're jumping around a little bit, but we got to get all this stuff in kind of together before we're done. Modems, modulator, demodulator. And what modems do is they take analog signals and make them into digital signals and vice versa. So like typical telephones, back in the day would need that modulation because it was all an analog signal. It needed to be modulated to digital signals so that computers could understand it. And then it had to be demodulated so that it could go potentially back to owner analog. Human beings are analog, computers are digital. So somewhere there's some modulation, demodulation that happens when I'm using a computer. Sort of the same concept, just not the same piece of equipment. Asynchronous devices, which means there's no clock signal. Whenever you see asynchronous, that's that's essentially what we're talking about. There's no clock signal. There's no modem. Oregon Trail, baby. Remember doing that with Oregon Trail. Things, on these types of networks, you've got DTEs and DCEs. DTEs are data terminal equipment and DCEs are data circuit terminating equipment. The difference being usually the DT in the old days, DCEs were maintained by the ISPs. It was kind of the DMARC or close to the DMARC, where the DTE, the data terminal equipment, would be like the system, that you were using. DCE, DTEs they're synchronous, meaning there is a clock signal. So asynchronous, no clock signal. Synchronous, there is a clock signal. That clock signal wasn't maintained by the DTE or the DCE. It was maintained by a whole nother, usually it was maintained by a CSU, DSU, which then became a TSU, a terminal service unit. But it could also be done by the DCE. So this is kind of what that looks like. Now, if I'm doubting you're going to run into much of this unless you are working for a carrier. But there's some simple diagrams to make it all sort of make sense. Your DTE, there's your computer itself. The DCE is the data circuit terminating equipment, and that plugs into the telephone line. In the older days, typically those DCEs would be, depending on where they were used, actually. So if you had a modem like in your computer, that would be true. That would actually theoretically be a DCE, and that would be you using it. But in larger networks, it was typically the telcos that would running the DCEs. And then you can see on that far right diagram. So the one on the left would be more kind of like maybe a home thing back in the day. You're not usually using DB25 connections and modems anymore, but the theories still work. On the right would be, more of an enterprise sort of, application of a lot, really mostly the same technology, just tweaked. You have those CSU, DSUs, those would provide a lot of the clocking. It would also, depending on what type of network you were working on, you might have additional functionality like some frame relay settings, things like that. But those CSUs, channel service unit, data service units, which then became terminal service units. Yeah, that's where they go. And then your DCA switch in the telco. Now, in this particular instance, those CSU, DSUs are also DCEs. So you can have a DCE connected to a DCE, connected to a DCE, connected to a DCE, connected to a DTE. So don't think that DTEs can only communicate with DCEs. There's a combination of things. All right, the most common use of these terms, DTE and DCE. DCE was typically the end of the ISP's network. That's where it ended, and then everything beyond that was responsibility, including the data terminal equipment. Where they meet, that's called the DMARC. So going back here, you can see where the DMARC is. The CPE in that diagram on the right stands for customer premise equipment. And then the one in the middle is the telco. So if you were questioning that. All right, authentication protocols and frameworks. Authentication, you remember that, right? Identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. That's our IAAA. Just professing an identity doesn't really mean squat. You have to, well, not for security anyway. You have to authenticate, right? How do I prove my identity? In this case, not proving the identity of a person, but proving the identity of a system on a network, or proving the identity of the network itself, right? That's what these authentication protocols come into play, and then the frameworks that they operate within. There are standards here. So the first one, old, dead, hopefully, I suppose you can probably still configure it, but there's no security built into it at all, was PAP, Password Authentication Protocol. Things to remember, just really weak. Everything's in clear text. So yeah, you have a password, but it's in clear text. And you can see the communication is very simple. Username this, password this, accept or reject. It's just a two-way fast communication. So recognizing that needs to be improved, challenge handshake authentication protocol was kind of the next thing. Lots of different implementations of challenge handshake authentication protocol. The things to remember is that the passwords, in most cases, the password's never exposed in clear text. In some cases, the password is never even sent on the network. What gets sent is a challenge. So I want to communicate on the network as a client. The chat server, excuse me, I need something to drink. The chat server would send a response, and it would be basically a challenge token. And then I would take that, calculate a hash of that. Potentially, this would be the simplest implementation. Take that challenge, hash that with my password, and I would send that back. So the password never went. What went was a hash of my password with this challenge that came from the authentication server. The authentication server, having a database of my passwords, would be able to calculate that same thing, compare the hashes, and authenticate. That's one way to implement CHAP, but there are multiple ways to implement CHAP. Things to remember about CHAP is that the password isn't exposed in clear text. The biggest vulnerability in CHAP implementations is password stored in clear text on the CHAP server, ironically. So a little more detail about how that communication works in another implementation. So in this case, we have a client unauthenticated, going to start that communication with LCP. That starts this three-way authentication process. The server is going to send back a challenge, some random string. The server knows that, and it's called the nonce. The server knows this random string, and it'll keep record of that. It doesn't matter that the cool thing that it's random is it prevents us from a replay attack potentially. So the user gets this challenge string, or the client gets this challenge string, hashes it, maybe hashes it with its password, and then sends that back. And like I said, the server can do the same thing and compare them in there. Cool. A little more detail on that if you're interested. These are the most important things, this one and this one. 802.1x. So 802.1 There's our IEEE again. So these are standard based. EAP is extensible authentication protocol, and it is what it says it is, extensible, meaning I can plug and play, add more things to it potentially. So 802.1x port-based network access control. These are things that I can put on my switches potentially. Same thing with wireless, right? I can use 802.1x as well. Keep things, so you have to authenticate with the network prior to getting access to the network. These things happen at layer 2. Yeah, so anything that operates at layer 2 can use port-based network access control, theoretically. Extensible authentication protocol, you can see in EAP, the client is called the supplicant, and the authentication master, or whoever the authenticator is going to be, is the authenticator. Yeah, different types of EAP. EAP, you got LEAP, EAP, you got LEAP, EAP, PEEP. You got a lot of different versions because it is extensible. Anybody, you can write your own authentication protocol towards this if you wanted to. Lightweight, extensible. That was one of the first ones. Not very secure. Kind of died. It was Cisco proprietary. EAP TLS. The thing about EAP TLS is it uses PKI, and I have two-way authentication. Not only does the client authenticate with the server, but the server authenticates the client. So you have this dual authentication. Awesome, really secure, still really secure today. But that complexity of having to maintain your PKI and make sure that these certificates are kind of lining up, that it does get complex and does get costly. So that was kind of its downfall, or kind of is its downfall, is that. So TLS, a little less overhead with this one, but we dropped the client side certificate. So, a little less secure. There's only one-way authentication with TTLS. That also doesn't require PKI, so maybe that's a good thing. And then PEEP, protected EAP. Yeah, this was a joint venture. Kind of the same, works a lot the same way as EAP TTLS. Also doesn't require client-side certificates. And so I, to help memorize this stuff, I just, found this table that should help you, as a quick reference. EAP MD5. So when you think, you remember what MD5 is, right? That's a hash function that is pretty susceptible to collisions, but maybe that's not a big deal, in your environment. No mutual authentication, no PKI. Yeah, vulnerable to dictionary attacks, and then all the way over to LEAP. And all these are, they're common enough. VPNs, slip-in PPP. So VPN, virtual private network. Slip-in PPP are old, sort of attempts at virtual private networking. PPP is still alive, and things are built on top of PPP. Slip is pretty much dead because it was just flawed and slow and old, I guess. But layer 2 protocol. So the reason why PPP is still alive is because IPsec happens at layer 3, right? So I can run PPP and IPsec on top of that, which isn't all that uncommon. And same with slip. So usually at layer 2, that's usually where you see more tunneling and less encryption. So tunneling would be to whoever's seeing this network traffic. They may never even see it, actually, because it's tunneled. It appears as though it's just a site-to-site connection on the public network. No encryption. So if I were able to intercept that traffic, I would be able to read the traffic. Layer 2 is usually the tunneling stuff, whereas layer 3 is, more of the functional encryption things. So no encryption, or no confidentiality, no integrity, no authentication with slip. It was it worked, but that was about it. So PPP, based on HDLC, high-level data link control, replace slip. It does give us a lot more functions you can do. And you could, if you wanted to. I don't think you'd ever want to, but you could protect slip too with encryption, but I don't know why you'd waste your time. So PPP, confidentiality, integrity, availability are all, there in the point-to-point links. we'll talk probably, we may mention PPP a little bit more later on. But here's where VPNs really kind of started to take off. PPTP in the early mid 90s. PPTP was sort of the first PPP via IP. So this, whoops, sorry. So it was still alive. Microsoft kind of led the charge. This was built into NT95, I think. Uses that GRE. So if you remember when I was talking about protocol numbers, GRE is that generic routing encapsulation. That's what I guess provides kind of the point-to-point piece of this. And then the control TCP port 1723. Layer 2 tunneling protocol was meant to sort of replace PPTP or at least add additional functionality. It's strictly a tunneling protocol. There is no confidentiality built into it. If you wanted to use encryption with L2TP, you'd have to use IPsec or something else, at a higher level. Right. VPN. So why do we need to have VPNs? Well, IP has nothing. IP was never built with security. Something insecure to the core will always be insecure. So there was just never, it was never built for it. So you had to add something to it. Now, when IP version 6, when we were designing that protocol, IPsec was built into it. So it was just porting it, to IP version 4. So that's kind of how IPsec is what it became. Two major protocols here: encapsulating security payload and authentication header. The good thing is those are pretty self-explanatory in what they do. Encapsulating security payload actually does the encryption, or does encryption. Authentication header doesn't. It just authenticates the packet essentially. So protocol numbers for these are IP protocol numbers. They're not TCP port numbers. IP protocol number 50 and 51. I don't know if that'll be testable, but it's good to know. And this is what they look like. So in transport mode, authentication header, you can see that it added its own header in between the IP header and the TCP header. And then you have the data, nothing trailing. Whereas encapsulating security payload actually includes the encryption. We added our own header and our own tail. And they can be used together too. And that's kind of what that would look like. It's good to know. I think important things: authentication header, no encryption. Encapsulating security payload does have encryption, and they can be used together. I think be the most important things to remember about this with IPsec. If you want a little more detail on how that sort of looks and how those things get put together, this is a diagram that you can reference. Architecture. So how an architecture here with IPsec is how could I actually use IPsec for communication? 3 ways: host to gateway. That's also called client mode, where the IPsec client, you have to have IPsec client software running on the client for it to talk to or set up those tunnels and everything else with IPsec gateways. There's also gateway to gateway. This would be a point-to-point VPN. That's another way that you can run IPsec, and then there's host to host. A little less common, but can certainly be done. Where 2 systems that run IPsec, they either have an IPsec software running on them, or they have native IPsec built into them, can do that host-to-host communication. A lot more rare. Those are other VPNs. So those are IPsec, and we'll probably hear more about that as we continue. Not tonight, but in the future. Other VPNs, we have SSL and TLS VPNs. SSL's kind of been, it's gone. Should be gone. So they work over HTTPS, TCP port 443 we talked about. TLS, your book will say TLS 1.2 is the most current version, but it's actually TLS version 1.3. So I added that to the slides. You'll get tested on TLS 1.2, potentially, not details. You'll get tested on, what way you would use it and stuff like that. But TLS 1.3 is actually what's used in practice today. TLS 1.2 is pretty much deprecated, or in most places. But TLS itself was meant to replace SSL, which was deprecated in June 2015. It was slow and insecure. And you can tell all kinds of other protocols, because these things work. You're talking about working at level on the, on the higher level protocols can do all kinds of things with the lower level protocols. So you can tunnel all kinds of different other IP protocols with the SSL TLS tunnel. No client software needed. It's sort of built in. IPsec can be difficult to firewall. SSL might be a little bit easier because there's just less changes in the communication. This is what that looks like. So there's our SYN, SYNAC, and ACBAC. Now we've got the connection established. That's our TCP three-way handshake, and then just how we negotiate. Essentially, you're going to oversimplified. You're going to use public key cryptography to sort of negotiate or set up kind of an initial secure communication, and then you're going to negotiate or create a session key. And in that session key, that'll be more symmetric encryption where you'll have the rest of your communications. Because symmetric encryption is stronger and faster. That's an oversimplified version of what you're seeing here. ISDN, Integrated Services Data Network, Digital Network. This was a lot of stuff with ISDN. You're probably not going to see ISDN. It is out there still, believe it or not. The copper pair. So ISDN was originally designed to send data and voice traffic on the same copper network, which at that time when it was first, it was kind of revolutionary at the time. I mean, I can send data on my phone line. That was kind of the beginning. Devices are called terminals. Two different interfaces with ISDN, either basic rate interface, which is 264 kilobit per second digital channels, which gives you a total of 128. That 16 is not used for data. It's just used for signaling. So it'd be 128 kilobits per second. Now, back in the day, that was pretty killer when you were running, 33.6 or lower. The other one is primary rate interface, which is, if you thought of that as being essentially the same as a T1, that's pretty close. It's about the same thing. 2364K channels. So if you do the math, that ends up at, 1.544 ends up to T1. And then you have your one signaling channel. So BRI 128, PRI 1.544, basically 2364K channels. Then DSL, digital subscriber line. This was a big deal when this first came up because, man, we're going to get I can get rid of my modems now. And not my modems. I can get rid of that modem for something else. The last mile would be essentially from we call it central office, but it was basically where they demarked their own network. That DSL is there, or ISDN, because we use the same sort of thing. We use those almost interchangeably. That central office. The closer you were to the central office, closer you are, the faster your speeds typically. Common DSL types, SDSL. There are a lot of different DSL types, but the ones I think you need to know for the test, symmetric. So when we think about symmetric, that means same, right? So same upload, same download. Really easy to remember that one, symmetric DSL. Asymmetric means faster download. They're not the same speed. Faster download, slower upload. Symmetric is more common today, I think, than asymmetric. Very high data rate digital subscriber line just means very much faster asymmetric speed. So you get super fast downloads. Your upload may not even change, to be honest. HDSL requires 2 pairs of copper. So that's high speed data, or high data rate DSL. I think if you remember, so I'm trying to create tables to kind of summarize this stuff to make it just easier for you to remember. So here's a nice simple table for ADSL, SDSL, HDSL, and VDSL, which I think are the ones that are probably the most common that you'll see on the test. Cable modems, cable modems. You remember we were talking about coax. Cable modems use coax. The modem does do somewhat sort of modulation, demodulation, but a little bit different. The thing about cable is you're sharing bandwidth typically with a group, maybe a neighborhood, maybe an entire town, a street, maybe. It depends on how they've sort of set that up, which means during peak times, you may not get as good a performance as non-peak time. So if everybody's kind of, usually after dinner, that time, you might see some slowness in the network. Now they try to accommodate that by doing some tuning, I guess, but yeah, whatever. I wonder how much they really care sometimes. All right, so these two things, callback and call ID, were ways that we would authenticate and try to secure modem dial-up. So you would dial in, so think of modem dial-up. You're probably not doing it now. It is actually still very effective if you want out-of-band sort of troubleshooting access, or something like that, because it runs on a different. It doesn't run on your ISP's network, right? If you're using true, POTS. I suppose if you can find it, but you can still find it. So if I was dialing into a server, the server would call me back at a pre-configured number. So I'd call into the server, I would type in my username and password, it would disconnect and call me back, right? And if I picked up, then it would start the communication. So that was one way to just try to validate that I'm actually the right caller. You could spoof that. So, whatever, you can spoof anything. But that's what callback is. Caller ID, different concept, but it's basically, if the caller ID doesn't the number that's been pre-configured to be able to dial into this, then you're not going to be able to dial into this. But as you know, that's very, very easily spoofed. There's services all over the internet that you can subscribe to for that. Instant messaging, we like instant messaging. It's funny that, you look at this and say AOL Instant Messenger, ICQ is still around. AOL Instant Messenger, I don't know if that's still around, but brings back like shivers a little bit. But those were some of the pioneering instant messaging applications. Nowadays, we're using using Zoom, Slack, Signal. I mean, there's a lot of different instant messaging sort of applications and functions around, but they do pose security challenges, right? It's a lot of them are running over port 80. So you'll need some sort of application layer. If you wanted to filter that traffic, you almost have to do some sort of application layer filtering. You could proxy it, I suppose, but you do other application layer filtering. Yeah, so there's a security risk there with instant messaging applications because they also allow file transfer. They emulate peer-to-peer, but they're really not peer-to-peer. They go over something else. And I think that's the point, is to just understand that they seem innocent enough when you're using Teams or when you're using Signal or Slack or something else, but you might be introducing some significant risk. Internet relay chat was one of the kind of older ones that's still around today, actually very popular. IRC servers, there's a lot. They have a very storied history with IRC. The default IRC port is 6677, but you can run it on whatever port you want to. So if you're just going to be blocking 6667 outbound, that's easy to get around that. Used to be for really legitimate purposes, but attackers use it too, right? A lot of attacks have been originated through IRC command and control. So that's IRC. Remote desktop console access, really super convenient, right? Because I don't have to get up and go into the data center anymore and, flip my switch and figure out, how to connect to the right system. It's just easier to just, telnet or login, use VNC, RDP. I mean, there's so many applications now that allow you to do remote desktop. You got to be really careful, right? You need to lock that stuff down as much as you can. We still see RDP out there often secured with nothing more than a username and password. It's like having a big neon sign blinking saying hack me, hack me, hack me. Yeah, so you got to be really careful about where you're using RDP. The Oldsmar attack that happened not that long ago down in Oldsmar, actually where I'm at, sort of that way in Florida, right? That water treatment plant attack was a remote desktop console. It wasn't RDP. I can't remember exactly what application it was, but it was one of these. It's convenient, but if you don't secure it right, it can be disaster. All right. Well, that's it. I think we did okay today, better than yesterday or Tuesday, Monday, whatever the hell day it was. And that concludes that chapter. So we're done with chapter 5. We go into chapter 6 now, which is identity and access management. Two separate things. A lot of times people are treating IAM like it's one thing, like identity and access management is one thing. They're two different things. You have to manage the identity first before you can manage the access that the identity has, right? So it'll be kind of fun for chapter 6. You can share a lot of hopefully a lot more stories. I think most of the things in the last 2 classes were relevant because they were foundational, fundamental things that you'll need to know for the test, but you can probably forget afterwards, are things like SDLC, HDLC, some of the legacy stuff like STAT25, ISDN. You probably never run into that stuff, but you will need to know it for the test. But the other stuff like the TCP/IP, that version, TCP/IP version 4 is the same as it was back then today. So really, really important to understand the basics of TCP/IP. And what I would say is, learn what you learned here in the last 2 days or 2 sessions for the exam, but then don't stop there with TCP/IP because there's still more you should probably dig into. So pass the exam and then maybe go spend a little more time on how networks operate, because everything, right? There's no communication if there's no network. So you got to understand the basics of that stuff. Other than that, you guys have a great night. I'm going to actually go get some dinner over here in Florida. So take care, guys. Thanks.